Welcome, everyone. I'm Nerissa Paglinawan, Program Manager of the Asian Arts and Culture Center at Towson University. On behalf of ANCC Director Joanna Pecori, I want to thank you all for joining us this evening for our panel discussion, Gardening for the Future, with artist Phaan Howng, anthropologist Natasha Myers, environmental designer Nicole DeFeo, and Herring Run Assistant Nursery Manager and native plant expert Mary Lewis. They will discuss issues around gardens and landscape practices to help us to rethink and mobilize towards a more environmentally sustainable future. This event is part of AANCC's Fall 2020 season, Cultivating Connections, which focuses on the connections we all have to each other and to nature. As many of you know, we opened the season with A Bag of Rocks for a Bag of Rice, an installation created by Phaan Howng specifically for ANCC's Asian Arts Gallery and the inspiration for tonight's panel discussion. The installation engages East Asian gardens to interrogate histories of empire, wealth, privilege, and exploitation responsible for ecological extraction and displacement. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, an all too real example of the very issues Howng illuminates, access to the exhibit is virtual through AANCC's website. Go to towson.edu/asianarts and select programs and exhibitions on the sidebar. There you will also find an informational PDF about the exhibit and a Zoom background you can download. If you are a Towson University student, faculty, or staff member, you can make an appointment to see the exhibit by emailing asianarts@towson.edu. On Saturday, November 14 at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, join us for our virtual workshop, Pollinator Gardening, Designing Sustainable Habitats, which will be led by Blue Water Baltimore and Phaan Howng. Learn how you can help restore habitats for struggling pollinators by strategically planting native plants and learn how to design your own pollinator garden. Registration is required. We'll put a link to that in the chat. This Thursday night, we will present the 4th installment of AANCC's Our Stories Virtual Festival, a 6-week international festival celebrating our common humanity and the unique beauty of diverse experiences. The festival features 27 storytellers hailing from Baltimore and beyond. If you haven't joined us yet for Our Stories, you can catch the next 3 episodes live every Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time through November 5th. We will also have the archival videos of the festival available on our website at towson.edu/asianarts. We still have a limited number of our Wishes in the Wind Korean kite making kits that integrate art, social studies, and engineering. You can order them online at the link we're sharing in the chat. Before turning the program over to our panelists, I'd like to note that the Asian Arts and Culture Center is a self-support department of Towson University. That means we have to raise all of the money needed for our operations and programs from memberships, grants, sponsorships, and individual donations. For those of you who have not yet contributed, please know that every dollar counts. Please donate $1 or more tonight. We'll put a link to AACC's online donation form in the chat. I would like to thank the generous donors who have made our fall season of programming possible. The E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, Maryland State Arts Council, Yoshinobu and Kathleen Shiota, William G. Baker Jr. Memorial Fund, creator of the Baker Artist Portfolios, Central Baltimore Partnership, ANCC members, TU College of Fine Arts and Communication, Citizens of Baltimore County, Roe and Mary S. P. Johnson Legacy Charitable Fund, the Harold J. Kaplan Fund, TU COFAC Diversity and Inclusion Committee, TU Marketing and Communications, TU BTU Presidential Priority, Robert Mintz and Beth Arman, Anthony and Bonnie Montcalmo, Alexander Nagel, Connie Rosemont, and John Greenberg. Thanks to all of you who support us. Finally, at the end of tonight's program, we'll ask you to complete an online survey to let us know what you thought of the virtual event. Your feedback is essential to keeping our programs funded and to helping us create better programs. I would now like to introduce artist Phaan Howng, who will introduce our other panelists. Phaan Howng's work centers around various narratives and landscapes that show the planet thriving in a utopian post-human future, or what she terms an optimistic post-apocalypse. Howng places the viewer in an idealized or satirical imagined future to encourage reflection on current environmental conditions fostered by extractive global capitalism. Explorations in current philosophy, anthropology, and history ground these investigations that interrogate Western concepts of nature, the human, and time. Through painting, sculpture, installation, and performance, her works speaks to issues of environmental, political, and social exploitation. Howng lives and works in Baltimore, Maryland. She received her MFA from the Mount Royal School of Multidisciplinary Art at MICA in 2015, and her BFA in painting from Boston University in 2004. Howng has held solo exhibitions at the Baltimore Museum of Art, Smithsonian Arts and Industry Building, Spring Break Art Show in New York City, Arlington Arts Center in Virginia, School 33 in Baltimore, and she received a Ruby's Artist Project Grant in Media Arts and Performing Arts in 2017. Please join me in welcoming Phaan Howng.
Woo! Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Nerissa, and thank you to all the sponsors who are able to support this program, because it's going to be exciting. Really quickly, let me just share my screen. Anyways, again, my name is Phaan, and I'm the artist with the current exhibition right now here at the Asian Arts and Culture Center at Towson University. And again, like, I want to welcome you to the second public component of the exhibition that I titled Gardening for the Future. So go through and so in case you weren't able to make the why are you not playing, Mr. Video? Hopefully it'll start playing. Oh my God. Anyways, but I'll just continue. So in case you weren't able to make it to the virtual opening, the exhibition, simply put, critiques the naturalness of Chinese and Japanese gardens. So for instance, typical associations that come to mind are Zen, meditative, and enchanted spaces inspired by nature. But like, how natural is a Chinese or Japanese garden? And I guess we forget, what are the environmental and ecological implications in creating these spaces, since they are technically hyper constructed environments, and how do we how do these spaces use nature in a way to camouflage histories of empire, wealth, privilege, and ecological extraction? But China, and I'm sorry that this video is not going anywhere, and it should be, as we rehearsed in our technical rehearsals anyways. But again, yeah, Chinese and Japanese gardens are just a case study or one example, and these same critiques can be applied to any type of garden and other landscaped environments. So to further this conversation, and to be honest, my knowledge is still pretty limited and there's still so much to learn, I wanted to bring these three amazing women experts who can speak on this subject fully. And so I guess because this is taking forever, we're just going to scrap this and pray that my computer will work. So before we begin, and before I introduce our guests, I wanted to acknowledge that my exhibition and this panel discussion does take place on the ancestral lands of the Pascagoula people, which is known today as Baltimore and Towson. So since my thing is not working, which is great, and I'm going to try one more time really quick. And I guess it doesn't like video today. This is the second time this has happened. Sorry. I'm just going to go ahead and move forward with introducing our panelists. So our first panelist is Natasha Myers. Natasha is an esteemed anthropologist and associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at York University in Toronto, Canada. She is also the director of the Plant Studies Collaboratory. Natasha's plant-based research documents the effective ecologies that take shape between plants and people, and among plants, their remarkably multi-species relations. She examines how the phenomena of plant sensing and communication are galvanizing inquiry in both the arts and the sciences and how people stage their relations with plants in botanical gardens and in ecological restoration projects in urban parks. These projects are part of a new book she is working on called Rooting into the Planthropocene, a term that she coined in 2016, seeding plant people conspiracies to grow livable worlds. And Natasha has been a huge influence of mine. So I'm really, really excited that she is able to be a part of this conversation. And then next we have Mary Lewis. Mary Lewis, if you want to wave also, that could probably help, is the assistant manager at Blue Water Baltimore's very own plant nursery, Herring Run Nursery. And we have, I had a previous installation that worked directly with Blue Water Baltimore. So I'm happy to be able to, again, work with Blue Water Baltimore again. Anyway, so Mary has over a decade of experience working at nurseries and farms and an educational background in environmental studies and sociology. So this combination has led to an ever increasing interest in connecting people to the land. And when she's not working, she enjoys spending time outside with her family. And then finally, Nicole DeFeo, if you want to wave and say, hey. Nicole DeFeo is an environmental designer based in New York City, focusing on the intersection of the built and natural environments that create public space. Trained as an architect, DeFeo is constantly inspired by the potential of the smallest of green spaces to foster community, human or ecological, in the urban landscape. DeFeo holds a bachelor's degree in environmental analysis and policy from Boston University and a master's of architecture from the Parsons School of Design. Nicole has also worked on award-winning projects that exemplify urban environmental stewardship at the Queens Botanical Garden, the High Line, and the New York Botanical Garden. So I guess let's get started. And I'm going to, again, one more time, try to share my screen and hopefully that it works. Oh, and it does. This is so great. Finally. Nope, that's not what I wanted, but I guess this is it. So as we begin, I wanted to start our discussion about the unnaturalness of gardens. And I guess maybe, well, okay, I'm not going to attempt it. So the dictionary definition of natural is existing in or derived from nature or not made or caused by humankind. And so with that definition in mind, if we really dissect, say, our home garden, a botanical garden, or even a public park, they are technically not natural. They are contained environments that require human interference and energy. So then, in thinking of those concepts, why do we consider them showcases for the natural? And why is that the case? And I want to start with Natasha. So your concept of the Planthropocene and your essay From Edenic Apocalypse to Gardens Against Eden perfectly touches on the natural versus unnatural. And I was wondering if you can talk more about that.
Wonderful, of course. So thank you so much, Phaan, for this great show that you're doing and this wonderful work that you're doing. It's really great to be here.
Yay, thanks for coming.
So this question about the natural is such an important question for us to think about. And one of the things we might have to do is throw out the dictionary definition. I think we might be in a place where what we thought nature was is something that we will have to let go of in order to move forward and rethink our gardens in really transformative ways. So nature in these Western contexts, and perhaps also in the context that you're looking at, and I think the context of working on gardens in China and Japan is a really important counterpose. But in the context that I've been working in Western gardens, gardens are sites where we imagine taming nature, where nature is tamed by the human very often in this sort of this hierarchy where we have kind of man against nature, or man controlling nature, or dominating nature. And the notion of nature as that realm that is untouched by humans in our definitions is precisely the kind of thinking that will get us caught up in you know, these very strange times that we're in now, where we see that our alienation from nature is precisely what is producing these apocalypses all around us. And so I want us to be able to expand on our thinking and open up of our thinking and begin to reckon with the ways that we are not separate from nature, but we in fact are of nature. And that might actually begin to help us think through what a garden might be, and what a garden is, but also what it could be. So thinking about artifice, thinking about what it is that humans do to nature as the most important piece, I think is a really important place for us to challenge. And so I've done a little bit of work in Singapore, so thanks for bringing up this image, where Gardens by the Bay is what could be described as $1 billion infrastructure for end of time botanical tourism. And I think about it in this way because this is a site where they have gathered plants from Mediterranean climates from around the world, the Mediterranean climate, which is a climate, not a region for plants. They've gathered them there in these air-conditioned domes. And in these domes, they've collected up bits of nature that are beautiful, that are opulent, that are decorative. It's this aesthetic of a kind of Eden. And yet what I've paid attention to in much of this is also, as we saw for that other image, the labor, right? It takes a lot of labor to make nature look natural when you've simulated it inside of a dome like this. And so I want us to think about these kind of massive complexes, these botanic gardens, these huge kind of touristic spaces that we go to visit nature as precisely not places of nature, but actually places to look at how humans stage their relationship with nature. And so we can think about gardens themselves as sites where people express how it is they see themselves in relationship to nature. And if they see themselves as alienated from nature or separate from nature, then they're going to build these kinds of incredibly opulent, energy and capital intensive complexes that in fact are producing kind of simulations. And in one sense, at the top of this garden is an installation called The Lost World, where they've gathered nearly extinct plants and juxtaposed them to animalized sculptures of indigenous people, as if all of these beings were already lost. There's a way that this kind of space, by gathering plants here and keeping them safe, in this kind of climate controlled environment, they're also neglecting the entire world that's coming apart around them. And so this is actually the one place that you can come to in Singapore and breathe fresh air during those times where the forest fires that are devastating Borneo and many other sites are decomposing worldwide. And so when we think about these enclosures, we have to think about all of the rest of the life that gets neglected when we kind of force life to live in these kinds of spaces. But again, I read these gardens as symptoms of our alienation from the living world. And what I'm interested in thinking about are the ways that gardens could be otherwise. And so I look to the work of Lois Weinberger, who is this remarkable Viennese artist who actually recently passed away. He's someone whose work I've thought with and written about, and recently found out that he has passed. But here we see him watering the weeds in Brandenburger Tor in Berlin in 1994 as a performance piece, showing kind of like the ways that humans could stage their relationship with the living world. Here he is in an empty lot full of weeds that we would normally revile, weeds that we might rip out, weeds that we would reckon as either invasive or unwanted. And here you see this kind of gesture of him kind of tending this as if it were a wild garden. If we look at the next picture, we see this remarkable performance piece by him where he himself has become the container to plant the seeds in the garden. And here we see him reorienting the role of the human to make the human the sort of support for the potential of new life growing in the soil. And these are the kinds of gestures that I see as really profound counterposes to imagining the ways that we normally see nature. Here, Weinberger actually pulls himself into a mode of embodiment that reckons that he is of the living world rather than separate from it. And we see this gesture, in a sense, as a way of reckoning with him, seeing his responsibilities, seeing what it is that he has to do in order to nurture plant life. And so what if we were to stage our relationships with a living world differently? What if we were to plant different kinds of gardens? And so here I'm really interested in us thinking past this idea that a garden is a site for humans to control nature, but is a site for people to be in collaboration, for people to conspire with the plants in order to grow livable worlds. And I think of this concept of a conspiracy, which in the Latin root means to conspire, to breathe with. If we could figure out a way to breathe with the plants who themselves are breathing us into being, we may be in a very different place when we go to design our gardens. How would we design our gardens? As if we were of service to the plants, as if we were in solidarity with them and their allies. If we grew our gardens so that we could practice a kind of more than human community service, not only to the plants, but to all of their pollinators, to all of their allies, and to all of the animals who nourish themselves in our gardens. So there's different ways of thinking about gardens and a relationship to nature. And if we practice that relationship differently, I think we would have very different kinds of futures. So I can leave it there for now.
Thank you so much. So kind of going off of that, moving on to the next question, you know, going from, I guess, like Gardens by the Bay in Singapore, the next question I want to pose is to Nicole. And Nicole, like, you have experience working for the New York Botanical Garden, the High Line, the Queens Botanical Garden. Can you describe like the kind of work and like the labor like that Natasha has touched upon, that it takes to manage these spaces to like meet the level or like to like of prescribed expectations, you know, of these gardening spaces?
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that primer, Natasha. It's such a great thing about these spaces. And I've been reflecting since invited to this panel. Thank you, Phaan, for bringing us together, of how these three places, organizations, and also projects that I've worked on in New York City kind of address this issue a little bit differently in terms of control, dominance, or containment of nature. And so this, like Phaan mentioned, we're going to talk about the High Line, the Queens Botanical Garden, and then the New York Botanical Garden at the end, and how they all kind of play a different role in how the public perceives the natural environment, specifically in New York City. So this is an image for folks that aren't familiar with the High Line. It's a public park now, but it once was a freight line on the west side of Manhattan that was left abandoned for many years and was no longer in use. And so that first image we saw was the landscape kind of reclaiming this elevated platform and what happened when no trains were running on this elevated track. And due to its proximity to the Hudson River, this landscape was born. You can see the relationship to the city here. The High Line is an elevated train track that brought train traffic, freight traffic off of 10th Avenue, which you see on the right of the map there, and into the street grid, so it could have direct access to all the buildings in the neighborhood to deliver agricultural goods and services, and then connect to the regional rail networks and get those goods and services out to the rest of the country. And so now that it's a landscape, it's created essentially a series of microclimates that as you walk up this 1.5 mile long landscape and public park, you experience these different kind of rooms or episodic landscapes that are meant to connect you to that kind of native wild landscape, if you can use the term native, this reclaimed landscape that happened naturally. So I love this photo of looking at the Whitney Museum here at the southern end of the park, because you can see kind of how thin the park is. It's really just this steel and concrete layer upon which a self-seeded landscape was born, and then a really highly designed landscape that was meant to evoke that self-seeded landscape. So the present day High Line is in reality a highly maintained space that evokes feelings of wildness, of prairies, of savannas, of a forest. So again, here's an image of it when it was abandoned. And then if we go to the next slide, this is that same area of the park. This is Savannah in New York City. And it's incredible to see kind of, you know, what do you prefer, the previous or the post kind of landscape, but the amount of effort it takes to kind of recreate something that was occurring naturally to begin with, and that made the founders of Friends of the High Line fall in love with it and want to save the structure. So we keep moving the slides. So again, you can see why people love the park. It's this feeling of immersiveness in a wild landscape, which, to Natasha's point, is so rare for urban dwellers in today's day and age. And so people come to the park to get this feeling, even though it's so narrow, of being immersed in a landscape that they don't have access to normally. We keep moving. And again, here you see the proximity to the waterfront. That's the Hudson River beyond this water feature. There's some aspects of the Highland that are immersive, but again, it's this very, very tiny, very narrow, 30 to 40 foot wide space that draws an incredible amount of visitors, close to 8 million visitors a year, which is on par with all the major tourist attractions in New York City, including visitors like these pollinators and other wildlife, birds, bats. We've seen a lot of different things on the High Line over the years. And so it's really this testament of what can coexist in this urban environment. If you plant the right plants, you can support an ecosystem of pollinators, of migratory birds, and what does it take to essentially do that? It doesn't take, honestly, very much. Again, this is all built up off of a concrete deck. And if we go to the next slide. So this is an example of the Queens Botanical Garden that took their site and it was trying to built a building to reconnect to the history of that site. So this is a site in Flushing, Queens, which is culturally very diverse, one of the most diverse counties in the country. And this project sought to reconnect visitors with the historical ecology of that site. So this was a low point in Queens, in Flushing Meadows. There is a creek that ran through this site. And so this building basically exemplifies the importance of water, not only in a garden setting, but also the role of water in defining a building and its separate elements. So visitors are greeted with water, which is a unifying cultural element, of course, especially for gardens, and can also tie many building systems together. So this project seeks to kind of merge with the landscape, use the building as an educational tool to show visitors what happens to the rain when it falls, how it gets recycled. This project had the city's first publicly accessible green roof. So again, reimagining what these spaces can be and what these landscapes and buildings could look like in an urban environment. And then if we keep going to the New York Botanical Garden, this goes back to kind of Natasha's version of botanical gardens. This project was built, this is a picture from the turn of the 20th century, where the New York Botanical Garden, recently founded organization, took it upon itself to build a giant Victorian era glass house. This building houses 1 acre of plants under glass. And this is not a high-tech building like those gardens by the bay in Singapore. It's very drafty. And it's very low-tech in many ways. It's not high-tech at all, but the intent is there, right? To build a glass house, to house all these exotic species and to invite people from all over the place. This is the palm dome. You can see a worker there for scale, where we have palms from all over the world. So people come here to experience the exotic, to experience something that they would not normally see. And that's also, you know, has nothing to do with the region that we live in. So if you keep moving the slides, you see the incredible level of work. This is the photo on the right here is planting new palms after the dome was recently restored, a project I worked on. And so the photo on the left shows how scaffolding was built to protect these specimens. And then we added new specimens to the collection. And you see, I count at least 6 people that are trying to move this palm that I'm not even sure where it came from. And so there's a lot of like logistics involved in getting these specimens to the garden. Sometimes researchers collect them, but it's an incredible amount of work. I mean, this building has to be heated all year round. There's like emergency systems in place if the heat goes down, because the plants, obviously all tropical plants will not survive. And if you keep moving the slides, you'll see the building is also used as an exhibition space, not necessarily its original intent, but in an effort to draw visitors to the space in the winter. These are photos of the orchid show over the years, which takes place in February through the spring to bring visitors into the garden in the winter when maybe there's less visitorship, although we do get people there all year round. And again, there's a level of resource intensity here that you can clearly see from the photos. It takes a lot of effort to mount these shows. It takes a lot of plant material to put these shows on. And there might be questions as to whether or not that is the best use of time and resources. I can leave that to the discussion later. And again, this is a long tradition. So this is a photo from the 1930s of daffodils that were on display of exhibits. And again, thinking back to, 120 years ago, this was a very novel thing. I think in the age of the internet with, the ability to travel, I mean, we may take for granted experiencing different landscapes. So there was a time where people could not hop on a plane to the Caribbean or go to different places. And so these exhibition spaces were very important in kind of educating the masses or educating folks about different areas of the world. So thinking about it in context maybe could be a little kinder to the botanical garden institutions. But that's it. I'll turn it back to Phaan.
Sorry, I thought I unmuted. Thank you so much, Nicole, for that insight and background history of botanical gardens in New York, especially. And I guess I noticed that like the chat box is like blowing up, so we'll hold your questions to the end. And I know everyone's going to have like a million questions, so just so you know, we will get there. We will answer your questions. So the next question I wanted to ask is to Mary. And Mary, like I know you do a lot of like home consultations as part of your work with Herring Run Nursery, and like speaking of like going off on what we've already talked about, like do you see any faux pas like with like home gardening, landscaping, or do you have people making active changes, etc.? And I'm going to flip to the next photo of Herring Run Nursery.
Yeah, thanks, Phaan, and thanks for asking that question. And thanks for everyone who's here tonight. I'm really glad you asked this question. I wouldn't say that I noticed very many faux pas per se, but I would say it's very noticeable that everyone falls in their own place in the spectrum of understanding where we fall in our connection to nature, and having a home landscape is one way that we can make that connection stronger. So, there's sometimes people have inherited the landscape and just haven't had the time to make any changes that they want to, or they're not aware of any changes that should or could be made. But most people that are coming to the nursery, since we are specifically a native plant nursery, are at least aware of the importance of native plants in the landscape and their role that they play in the ecosystem. As far as our nursery customers go, we have folks who come to us who have never planted a plant before. We have folks who have been gardening their whole lives, who have gardening certifications. We have folks that find us by accident, and we have folks who've been coming to the nursery for many years. So it's definitely interesting to see where people fall with their relationship to the land. And a lot of times it's an afterthought. And I think one thing that's come from this pandemic is people are spending a lot more time at home and realizing that there is something they can do about their space if they haven't already. So I would say people are definitely making active changes. If you have us come out for a site visit, that's definitely an active change that you're looking to make just for that input. Learning about native plants and their benefits, whether you're sending us an email or following us on Facebook or coming out to the nursery, just learning about what native plants even are and why they are so important in our connection to nature. Also telling your friends about the nursery, telling your friends about a project you're excited about, planting at your place of faith, or if your kid's school is doing a pollinator planting. Those are definitely ways that people are definitely making an active change. And I'd say for our customers, the biggest thing we notice is when a customer is installing a new project, a lot of people are out walking around these days, and the neighbor stops and asks what's going on and asks about the project, and then they tell their neighbor, and then their neighbor's excited about it and wants to do something. So that's definitely a way to make a change. But also, we don't have just the nursery at Blue Water, we also have community tree plantings. So we have a lot of folks get engaged that way, who might not have a yard or might not be comfortable planting something on their own property, or maybe they rent their place where they live. So there's still definitely ways. We have a lot of fall plantings coming up if folks are interested in getting active that way. So another thing that we do is we really want people to be comfortable in their landscape. So we want to find that balance between the anthropocentric view that the garden is just for the person, and find out how we can have a garden that is attractive, but also serves more than just that purpose. So a pollinator garden, or if you have problems with stormwater on your property, which native plants are going to be best to help mitigate those issues. Really drawing in on that connection between the ecosystem and the landscape, and then also how we view it. I'm just trying to keep a balance, just like our ecosystem does. I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Mary. And I guess just like some more photos of, like pollinators, the butterflies, and all these things that you can have in your garden if you inserted native plants and everything there. So I guess kind of like furthering the discussion, and now I just want to open it up to everybody to just contribute. I guess I feel like after talking, I feel like there is still a level of control and I guess a containment of plant life. And I guess I've always been fascinated, why, globally even, why are we so interested in doing that? Why do we have to have plants in a container, in a garden, a yard, a certain that has a certain boundary to it? And I guess, Natasha, if you want to start us off, that would be fabulous. And then everyone just interject.
Awesome. It's such an important question, Phaan, because we have such a relationship of control with plants. We do, we have this practice where we want to put a plant in a pot, and then we want to be able to move it around, right? We have this relationship with plants as objects that are under our control, that we can decide where they belong and where they should go, and this kind of amazing dexterity that we have with our hands, but also with our bulldozers and all of our equipment and all of our technologies. But we have to, it's important to think about containment in much broader ways. So we have these really, we have these enclosures everywhere, and we can think about the enclosures that form the potted plant on our windowsill, or these enclosures that form the where you see this kind of a tree planted in a concrete pot on the side of the street. But if we think about our cities, the entire city itself becomes a container garden, right? So everything gets enclosed in concrete in some way. And then we can look to our forests and we realize, wait a second, those forests either are enclosed by park borders or they're enclosed by state lines, provincial lines, nation state lines. And those borders then also control who, what the plants look like within those borders, or what counts as a weed within those borders, what counts as something that that we want, something that we don't want. And so we have these enclosures worldwide, really almost, all of our land really is enclosed. And within that, plants end up within the domain of those people who are in control of the enclosures. And so one of the things that we have to start to rethink is that these containers that we create, whether they're concrete, metal, glass, or they're containers that are made by legal infrastructures, what we have in each of those is actually a possibility for us to step into our responsibility, right? So when you put the plant in a container, suddenly you are responsible for watering it. If we circumscribe the space in which a plant can grow, we are creating a smaller space for the roots, a smaller space for the water. We're cutting it off from all sorts of elements of its relations. We're cutting it off from its pollinators. We're cutting it off from, especially if we're bringing it indoors. And so one of the things we have to think about, if we do that work, then what is our responsibility? And how could we reckon with our responsibility to plants in really different ways? How could we listen to plants to say, maybe you don't want such a small container. Maybe you prefer a porous material to concrete, or maybe you would prefer not being planted in a container at all. Maybe you would prefer a porous enclosure. Anyway, so there's all the kinds of ways that we could shift our relationship to these containments and start to open up our ideas about enclosures. What if we inverted the enclosures? And so I think a lot about Lois Weinberger has a wonderful artwork that I didn't include in the photographs, but it's a giant cage that he put down on top of a lawn in front of an academic institution in Austria. And it was a giant cage that wouldn't allow any human to get into, but it allowed the lawn to be completely transformed over the course of 40 years into this flourishing wild garden. And so what he did in that moment was invert the enclosure, right? To keep the humans out and actually show what's possible for the beings inside if the humans are no longer in control. And so I want us to invite us to really break open our infrastructures of containment and break open our relationships with plants in order to sort of render ourselves more of service to them, to be able to realize that all of this means that we actually have bigger responsibilities, and those responsibilities are showing up for the plants, being in reciprocal relationship. So if we want something from the plant, we better be ready to give it something back. And we have to learn how to listen to them. So we need to take the time to learn how to tune into plant lives, into plant worlds, and into the kind of qualities of relationships that they build with the beings around them, how they use their beauty and color and texture and tastes to lure all kinds of beings, not just us. And so what if we kind of rethought the enclosure, rethought the containment? What kind of gardens could we grow?
Anyone want to go off of that? Mary, Nicole?
Yeah, I'll just say, use the High Line as an example. I think the High Line exemplifies what what Natasha was talking about. I mean, it was left abandoned for 20 years, and that there was literally very few human visitors to the elevated freight line during that time, from the 1980s to the late 90s. So I think that's what kind of captured the imagination of folks to see, because it was so rare to see what would happen if you let this, this giant piece of urban infrastructure kind of go untouched for 2 decades. What would happen? I mean, it's more and more, maybe, I guess you see what happens. And I think that that's a challenge that cities will will continue to face, right? Because we can't just keep going and like consuming more virgin land outside of city centers. We have to use everything that we've created. And if a piece of infrastructure doesn't serve us anymore, you know, how can it serve us? And whether that's humans or the ecology or connecting it back to the kind of original environment that once existed there. But I think, you know, at the heart of it, that's what makes the Highlands a successful project, because it captures this kind of wild imagination for people that they don't normally have a chance to experience. And that it's that juxtaposition, that contrast of, I mean, now it's maybe less wild than it once was because it is maintained by a staff of gardeners. But it was that's what made it such a compelling project, I think, in the beginning, to turn it into this space where you can see the contrast of kind of the untamed, the wild, with the urban environment, with the concrete jungle right next to it. So I very much agree with what Natasha was saying.
Yeah, to that point, I would also say that I really, when helping folks design their gardens and their spaces, I really try to use natural communities for inspirations, going for hikes in national parks and that type of thing, where you see these plants that coexist in a more natural setting, which is still being maintained, but is still sort of more this natural relationship. And if we can try to mimic that in the landscape, then maybe we can also try to let go of some of that control by using these natural systems as sort of a guide for how we can create our future landscapes. But I also just wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of boundaries that Natasha was talking on and how that applies to the native plant community, because when we determine if a plant is native or not, you know, we're deciding this range of how far it's sort of allowed to be, and there are so many factors involved where we're trying to feed birds and we want the birds to eat the seeds and we want them to spread the seeds, but whether or not that is inside or outside this boundary that humans have come up with it causes a lot of, I would almost say, controversy in the native plant world, and whether or not it's native, and if it's native one county over, could it be native here? So that's just something that I come across a lot with determining whether or not a plant is indeed native or not.
Any counterpoints to that? Go ahead, Natasha.
Yeah, I just love to speak to that. And I mean, this is a problem of colonialism, right? Not knowing what's native to where, right? We did a lot of work to erase the ecologies that Indigenous people created, and so for us to be the ones to deciding who is native where is actually it's a really problematic thing. And I'm working right now in an oak savanna ecosystem here in Toronto, and these lands, an oak savanna is a fire dependent ecology. It's an ecology that can only survive with people who have knowledge of fire. And so it's a beautiful example of what we could call a nature culture, where you actually can't take the people out of the landscape. It will no longer be an oak savanna. It would fill in. And we're here living in this time at a moment where colonialism has led to the absolute destruction of these landscapes. We have 1% of these oak savannas left. And we have a bunch of restoration ecologists coming in and deciding what counts as a native plant and what does not. And if it doesn't count as a native plant, they bring in the glyphosate, right? They bring in the Roundup, and they bring in all kinds of herbicides to get rid of it because they've just deemed it was a plant out of place. I'm working with a collective of Indigenous people and earth workers who are actually not so concerned about non-native plants. They also recognize that they are their relatives. They also recognize, right? And so the last thing they want to do is use chemicals. And the last thing they're going to do is decide who gets to live and die here. And, they absolutely want native plants to flourish, and the ones that they know well and the ones that are their medicines. But when non-native people tell them what counts as a native plant and what doesn't, and then uses these kind of violent chemical regimes to get rid of it, what we're seeing produced is a kind of dispossession, right? Is a kind of a way of actually keeping indigenous people off the land. So I'm really interested in recognizing that non-native plants love to take root in the sites of colonial and capitalist ruins, right? So non-native plants take root in the rubble of what's left behind when we extract value off land and when, you know, when we move in. And so actually non-native plants are just a symptom of colonialism, and they're, you know, but who's really the invader is the question that my Indigenous collaborators are asking. And so so the question of like these idea of pure nature is, well, the Oak Savanna restoration ecologists imagine that they have a perfect picture of what an oak savanna is supposed to look like, but these are people who didn't even know that an oak savanna was a site of nourishment, that these are subsistence ecologies where you eat food, right? No one recognized that this was like a food garden or a food forest. And so there's really deep kind of unlearning that we have to do as we start to take a look at the kinds of ecologies that we want to survive and start to reckon that they actually need the people who know how to steward the land. We need to bring those people back because they've had thousands of years of experience working with both native and non-native plants and actually making kin with those non-native plants. So there's layers here that you know, one of the things we can start to recognize is like an oak savanna is a wild garden, right? It is a garden in a really interesting way. You need fire, you need cultivation, you need all kinds of tending to make these things live. What if everything were a wild garden, right? What if everywhere we looked were a wild garden, and it was there were certain responsibilities that we had to ensure that the plants take root well. And that means, you know, not ruining landscapes and leaving them to rubble and leaving them to be taken over by plants that don't belong there and that may change the ecology. There are ways to do that. So it's, I think if we bring in native species, it's really important that we recognize that those plants belong to people. They belong to people, and those people have been removed from their land. So as we're living on stolen lands and reckoning with that history, how do we practice a lighter touch with regard to, you know, regard to those species that we don't think they belong? Well, they belong for someone. And how do we do that well? How do we ensure that the ecologies that we're fostering are rooting well and are served well by us? And I think that shifts our sense of our responsibility in some important ways. Back to you, Phaan.
Oh, thank you. I guess, and Nicole, Mary, do you want to speak to that? Or I guess, you know, I mean, it's like, that's, I guess what I love is just like, yeah, like how do we kind of like rethink, how can we reimagine gardening, and how can we kind of, you know, like start, you know, because like I feel like with climate change and with like, you know, like the ideas or concepts behind the Anthropocene, like it is kind of like this big, like abstract image, like where we feel kind of like anything we do could be so futile, you know, and like, and we just go into a spiral of depression or whatever, you know. And but I always like imagine, like, you know, there is hope and potential, like for us as individuals, like despite like, you know, like the bigger greater good, like coming together as a collective, but like what we can do as the individual to kind of create more positive change for our ecology. So I guess like, you know, kind of thinking like, yes, we're talking about constructs, we're talking about like the bucket, like the plant, but I guess like how can us, and this is a question for all of you, like how can we, you know, like, you know, just anyone, even if we don't have access to a garden, like say we live in an apartment, say we live, you know, like in a box, I guess, with no windows or something because of COVID, like how can we all individually start building these type of relationships to and start like these more conscious and mindful gardening practices, even if like with our, if we have access to a yard, if we don't. And I'll leave that up to you guys to answer.
I mean, I'll jump in and say what I think is really interesting, in spite of the kind of, again, thinking of urban landscape in particular, and how it is inherently fragmented, and you feel like you only have like this teeny tiny little patch that's available to you, that in reality it's kind of these places are essentially like corridors, and these little patches of green connect other species that can fly and that can, you know, move in ways that the plants cannot, right? So they can carry seeds, they can carry pollen, and cultivating even like a fire. I have plants on my fire escape. I'm part of a community garden, and like even just a couple of pots on a fire escape is enough to provide like a landing pad for a monarch butterfly, or provide respite for a bee. And these things aren't so, as much as we've talked about, like, I think the effort to contain, these things aren't really contained, right? So I think that's what people forget, is that these things aren't as isolated as you might think they are. And so if you make the effort to cultivate a tiny patch of green, it will connect to other patches of green. I mean, there's a birding club that exists around Bryant Park in New York City. Bryant Park is not a big park, and most of it is like a maintained turf because they have all these events and they're constantly changing things out. Somebody's playing tennis or watching a movie. It's like, I mean, not now during COVID, but they do have this wonderful woodland border of native plants, and it attracts all of these migratory birds that stop over. Maybe they're stopping over because Central Park is also nearby, but there's a dedicated birding club just for Bryant Park, in spotting and observing the wildlife that passes through. And it's literally, I used to eat my lunch in Bryant Park for many years. There's like reflected light. There's so many skyscrapers that there's reflected light into the park. So you're surrounded on all sides by tall glass towers, and yet it's a respite and it's a resource. And so I think, I guess I would advise people to never underestimate, even if you think you're like not a good gardener or like something's gonna fail, it's like better to try, because I think inherently you are supporting the service of other ecosystems that you may not be completely aware of.
Just to build on what Nicole is saying, I had the most pleasure this summer, spring, where I was like, you know, I'm going to try this. Take the cuttings from my vegetables that would have gone into the compost, and I grew beautiful carrot tops. I grew celery tops. I grew cabbage, and I put these plants out just, you know, on a tiny deck on the 3rd floor. And a swallowtail caterpillar landed on the carrot tops and just feasted and feasted and feasted for days. And I thought to myself, how simple. I literally saved from the trash the tiniest little bit of the carrot, just the tiny top. It rooted, it made flowers, it made seeds, and it made a plant nourishing enough for a swallowtail caterpillar to sort of make it through that next stage of its life. And so these kinds of tiny little gestures, and the pleasure that I got to have watching the cabbage growing, this tiny little bit of cabbage that ended up growing 3 shoots out of it, and is still vibrant and amazing, and it's this beautiful decorative piece. So just to think about the ways, like, it doesn't take anything, it doesn't take any money, it doesn't take even soils for some of these things to actually try to grow. And once you become captivated, once you get caught in this pleasure of watching these plants grow and feeling alongside them, it's like this falling in love all over again in a new kind of way. And I think what I think we need are generations of people growing up in new ways, in kinship with plants, growing tiny little gardens for their kitchens, cultivating a plant on their windowsill, or joining a collective of gardens. My vision for the future is we all take down the fences that separate our backyards and build community gardens for every city block, so that we can all nourish ourselves. And what that would do is actually change our relationships with each other. And what if our relationships with each other we're actually being propelled by the gardens, propelled by a shared and joint vision for food justice, for community, and for all kinds of forms of relating. And so in a sense, when you say fun, is there an individual act? Every act we make with a plant is opening ourselves up to a deeper relationship. So by cultivating that carrot top, I created a relationship with the swallowtail butterfly. So there's like it's like you're never alone when you're with plants. You're actually with a much bigger world.
Yeah, I love that point, Natasha, and being captivated by your garden. I mean, we have in my neighborhood a community mailbox where many houses share a mailbox that has lots of little things in it. And so right next to the mailbox, I planted some milkweed just to see, I haven't really seen many monarchs in our neighborhood. So then all of a sudden there's tons of monarch caterpillars in all different stages. And the kids before would come off the bus and I'd be out there with my little magnifying glass and, just making them aware, or not making them, but, just saying, hey, look, this is so cool. This butterfly, this caterpillar becomes this butterfly. But I also just wanted to mention that you don't need to have that space, even in right near your house. You can also get active in your community. If you don't have a community park, get active and get grants and get one, because there are many organizations that provide grant funding to get more green infrastructure in communities. And also there are so many organizations around the world, but in Baltimore, we have Blue Water Baltimore, where we're doing community tree plantings, getting trees into communities where they may not have them, or where there are a lot of stormwater issues, and the trees are going to be one of the best ways that we can try to absorb that stormwater. So you can get your hands dirty for free without having to invest anything in your landscape, without having to worry about maintaining it or cleaning up the leaves, or there's just so many ways that you can get active. And a quick Google search for the name of your city and planting trees can get you a lot of opportunities.
I would add to that quickly that
Thanks.
across the board, city parks are underfunded. It doesn't matter where you live. City parks are underfunded, and often the most successful parks are the ones that are actively stewarded by their community. And so the reason why the reason why Central Park is so glorious today is because it was neglected by the city. The city was bankrupt in the 70s, and the community gathered around and decided to do something about it and raised money and fought for that space that they all collectively share. So, I mean, criticisms on the whole public-private partnership thing abound, but I think that's a critical way to get involved. To Mary's point, there's always an opportunity. There's always an opportunity to get involved in your community in public green space.
But I guess I want to point out the fact these spaces that we're talking about are kind of more practical spaces versus, I guess, aestheticized spaces, versus, how, kind of making a conscious decision to plant more native plants in our area, wherever we are, if we're in New York, Baltimore, New Mexico, and versus the aestheticized garden, kind of going back to the Chinese or botanical gardens, where it's just where we're all doing it just sheerly for visuals, just sheerly where maybe there are positives, but aesthetically it's just this non-native plant that's there that may do a thing, I don't know, and trying to control it in a certain type of environment that it isn't destined to live in. So I guess as an example, I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and we had a lot of lawns. We had and it's a desert. We don't have any water either. And here we are trying to find ways to keep this Kentucky bluegrass lawn and maybe some roses and all that stuff. But it's just it's just not real, because this is the desert. You don't have grass that requires a lot of maintenance and stuff. So I was wondering if we can touch upon the differences between how we can have a more positive garden, for instance, like where we use the carrot tops to like cultivate, like, you know, to help the caterpillars, like all this like kind of like symbiotic relationships versus like maybe like a negative impact gardening practice, like a golf course, for instance, which I feel like is like super negative. Like it's beautiful, it's great, but like it just requires so much maintenance, you know. And sorry for all of you who love golf. I like golfing, but like really a golf course is like horrible. Like and kind of like, and then I guess speaking to Nicole about like the relationship of Bryant Park and still having like birds be able to like fly there. Like how do we like, yeah, can we have those relationships? Can we have a golf course and have native plant species next to, can we, anyways, and I hope, and like kind of like just going through the chat, like wondering, like hopefully these answer some of the questions that are in there too. And then we can go more direct into these questions. Sorry, if anyone wants to go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll say, I mean, the example of Bryant Park, I think, is an interesting one because it's a high density, high use space. But they do have this beautiful native woodland border that doesn't change, you know, that is just there permanently. And it's substantial enough to provide a sense of habitat, a resource. And I also think what the Queen's Botanical Garden did, you know, this project that opened up 10 years ago, their visitor center, this green building project, really departed from, at the time in New York City, what was considered, you know, aesthetic and appropriate for a botanical garden. The Queen's Botanical Garden doesn't have a conservatory. It doesn't do any research. At the time that this project was done, it was free to go in. So it was really more like a park, but it was the first project that used, they actually planted their native plants in the landscape in community. So they grouped them by community versus aesthetics or other reasons why you would group plants together. They used plants to filter water, to filter the gray water from the building. And it really was a departure to have this sense of like a landscape, this performative landscape, which I think you could argue every landscape is performative because it's providing a service, an ecosystem service of some kind. But I think it's kind of like embracing, you know, the High Line also did this too, where when the High Line opened up, people thought it was like messy. People thought it was full of weeds, and like changing this public perception of like what is beautiful. Because I think people look to botanical gardens to set the trends, to learn about home gardening trends and best practices. And so I think you can put pressure on these spaces to continue to showcase kind of what is best for that region or what is best for that area that you live in. And I feel like most botanical gardens are kind of going in that direction, but it's important. I mean, that's like, they have such a cultural touchstone. So many people pass through those gates. They have such a platform, right? So I think it's their responsibility to kind of use that to educate folks responsibly. And I think most do, but there is always this allure of like having these fantastical displays, which is like, I don't know how you move away from that. People are just like love flower shows, you know? They love these like ostentatious displays of like botanicals. I don't know how you like really phase that out. But it's important to consider.
I think this question around aesthetics is really important, and beauty, like what counts as beauty, is these are all really, you know, profoundly culturally specific questions, right? So but the aesthetics, I think, have to change, because the aesthetics of a native garden are really different than the aesthetics of horticultural varieties, and especially of the plants that we value for their opulence and for, right? So these, what I've thought of a lot as kind of Edenic aesthetics, these aesthetics that, you know, imagine a kind of Eden that is separate from the human, that is somehow an object for pleasure and leisure, versus a kind of the aesthetics of, you know, tall grasses and like goldenrod, right? So I struggle to keep the goldenrod in the garden. My mom is like, "Oh my God, take the goldenrod out of the garden." And I'm growing stuff in her garden, and so, but I'm trying, you know, but it's really a profound challenge to alter what people's expectations are of the plants. And if people expect plants to be adornments for them, for their, you know, leisure and pleasure, and they want them around, then it's we actually have to change that in order to shift our gardening practices. And so when we alter those practices so that we can learn to sort of recognize, say, the beauty of what Lois Weinberger was doing as he's watering the weeds in Brandenburg Tor. So these transformations I think will be very slow, but it means actually, you know, and the other piece that I'd love to bring up is this question about how around decomposition. So a lot of the issues that people have with plants is that they're dirty. They're messy. They produce leaves. So people will cut down their trees just because they don't want to rake the leaves, right? This idea that there's something messy about them and we have to deadhead all the flowers, we have to trim all of the dead bits. And it turns out these are the places the insects love to be. These are the places where they overwinter. These are the places where they get their nourishment. Those little dead bits at the end of the plant are habitat. They're like the lived in space. And so we have to start to recognize, how do we live with decay and decomposition as a part of the kind of life cycle of the plant, so that we get involved in processes of decomposition, involved in the compost, recognizing that getting our hands in the dirt, in that practice with the cycles of the plants through as they're moving through life and through into their seeding and into their decomposition, that we're with them through that, and we recognize that as beautiful.
I think also finding those connections and finding the beauty in that, as you mentioned with the swallowtail, I feel a lot of people develop one of their first plant relationships through butterflies, and how that is just such a major charismatic species for native plants in general, and learning to love the decaying process. And once you show people pictures of all of the butterflies that overwinter in the fallen leaves, and all of the butterflies and the caterpillars that are going to eat certain plants, where we may be trained to see, oh no, there's holes in these leaves, I must protect the plant, but shifting that to realize this plant, the reason for this plant is for this caterpillar, and they've evolved together for so long, and they're both here for each other, and that's the connection that we need to find the beauty in, rather than this pristine plant that looks so perfect it could be made out of plastic. If we can find that beauty in all of it, and how the bugs that are eating the plant are also the base of the food web, and as well as the plants being one of the lowest parts of the food web, but we can support these large, beautiful creatures and eagles and everything by providing food for the insects, which are the food for the small birds, which are, you know, work their whole way up. So, and caterpillars are also foods for a lot of migrating birds and baby birds, and birds that aren't normally eating insects. The babies often are eating caterpillars because of the protein. So it's just really important to find that beauty in the whole picture, rather than just a few leaves on a plant.
Someone just asked in the chat, how does the tent caterpillar fit into the ecosystem? And I just to bring it around to this question, I had an amazing sort of teaching from a plant expert who told me that those tent caterpillars, as they munch off the leaves, all of the poop falls down into the tree, you know, into the soil below, and that is the purest gold for the plant. It's actually a gift for the plant. And so even if that plant is having a hard time in that moment, it is benefiting immensely from this incredible compostable material that's actually being created for them by the tent caterpillar. So these are cycles that are longer than our, right? We have to recognize the temporality of the plant is longer than our ideas about what matters. Like it's by letting the tent caterpillars feed on it, it's preparing for its future, right? So it's leaning into the next season already. It's not so much worried about this season. And so we can start to recognize that plants have these practices. They know how to defend themselves against predators. They do have all sorts of ways, but they also allow themselves to be eaten. They allow themselves to be munched on, because they know that poop is going to go down into their own soil. So there's lots of ways to think about these relationships, and especially with organisms that we think of as pests. Definitely they can be out of balance and out of relation, but in a reasonable, what we would call infestation of tent caterpillars, you're actually dealing with a nourishing moment for the plant.
I would add just a quick note about death and decomposition and what people view. In my community garden, I feel like people forget that in terms of, the discussion that we're having about like the life cycles of plants, the seasonality of plants in relation to perennials. I've had the experience many times where people are like, the plant goes brown, it drops its leaves, and people are like pulling it out of the ground. And it's like, no, what are you doing? Like, it's still alive. I know it doesn't look alive, but it's still alive. It's going to come back. Like, if anything, it's getting like, it's setting its roots for like the next season. It's going to come back bigger and stronger. And the idea of like, I don't know how you kind of curtail this idea of like, oh, this is provided its service, it's done and needs to be removed, or the flower has fallen, there's a dead stem, it needs to be removed. I don't know where that is kind of how we absorb this innate kind of judgment, but it's fascinating to me to equate like a plant that is not green with a plant that is dead, because it's just simply like not what's happening. We don't cut down all the trees every year once they lose their leaves. So it's like it'd be like a funny way to approach everything. But it is very interesting how specific people get. But I do think one of the overarching benefits of getting involved with a gardening practice, however small, is just the seasonal observations. And I think that makes people have a greater appreciation of what is happening. And if you don't have that opportunity to observe the life cycle of a seasonal plant, not like your snake plant in your room, you don't have the opportunity to get a sense of what's happening and what emerges in the spring and what kind of blooms in the summer and what recedes in the fall, and then how it all happens again the following year. So I think that that's an important aspect, one important benefit of tending to plants, is you get to witness this whole life cycle.
So I guess I feel bad that we're like really close on going over time, and there are a lot of questions, and I hope that we were able to address these questions in some shape or form. But I guess one that really stands out to me, and am I muted? Am I talking? Yes, okay. Is, hold on, oh my God, wait, now I'm like lost. I like this question from Alyssa. If our landscapes and environments are constantly changing due to human interference, is there a point where a native plant is no longer native?
Well, I would say there isn't really, in my view, there isn't really a point when a native plant is no longer native, except that due to our changing climate, the ranges where these plants are going to survive is shifting. So, a lot of people use the, another butterfly example, but the Baltimore checker spot butterfly, which is the state butterfly of Maryland, its range is shifting to the point where we may not see them here. Same with Baltimore Orioles. Their range is shifting to the point where in 20 years, we may not see many Orioles in this area. So and those shifts have been happening forever, just shifts where plants and animals are shifting around. So there may be times where things that were once very prolific here don't survive any longer because our winters aren't as cold anymore, or our summers are too hot. So there's definitely this room for, I guess, just shift, but I wouldn't say that a plant would necessarily no longer be native. It just may not thrive, I guess would be what I would say.
And I guess going from that to Alyssa Ellis's question, is planting native plants as a restoration project our attempt to regrow a snapshot in time?
I think that's a really important question, because it's this idea that we have this idea of what it was, right? Like this idea that as if we thought we know what those relationships look like, especially when it comes to an ecology. And so restoration ecology often has this kind of idea of, let's just roll the time back and, you know, let's go back in time to that point where things were different. But it's from a colonial perspective, going back in time, you know, if you're imagining that the world, that, you know, this land was empty, so this idea of terra nullius, that there were no people and there was just pure nature, going back in time to a de-peopled world, imagining that it was just a pristine nature that was growing and it wasn't actually shaped by humans. This is a deep problem in restoration ecology, I would say, because their idea of the past is actually a fiction. And it's a really problematic fiction. It's a fiction that actually both produces enduring dispossession, right? It, you know, not only were the lands stolen, but now there's a total erasure, not just of the people, but also their ecologies that they actually made. And so we have to recognize that these are people who made the landscapes. They made the relationships between where was forest and where was not forest. They shaped the river systems, but the way they fish, you know, these are people who actually terraformed the land through their practices. And so if we try and go back in time and pretend that there was no one there, it's a deep problem. And so that's sort of a question of like, what kind of hindsight do we have, and how can we begin to reconstruct what past ecologies looked like? Again, as I said before, we'd really need to have the original people, the first peoples, involved in those conversations. And there are lots of issues around that. So yeah, I think it's a really important question, and the back in time is problematic for sure.
Another person asked, like Amy Bolt, like, how do we suggest landscape for people with physical disabilities? On one hand, major landscaping needs to occur for them to enjoy national/state parks. On the other hand, how does that work with the Wilderness Act?
I would say, I know that this is a challenge. I've worked with a lot of community gardens in New York City, and accessibility is a challenge because these spaces are maintained by volunteers, and usually the ground is very uneven or is irregular. And I know that that can sometimes be a barrier to access. And a lot of gardens have made efforts to raise, I mean, this doesn't get to kind of the latter part of her question, but to do something as simple as building raised beds at waist height so that you don't have to bend over, and it is more accessible to some folks. But I think inherently just being immersed in the landscape is beneficial to many people. At the Highline, the Highline is surprisingly one of the most accessible parks in New York City. There's an equity of access for all of the park features for the entire length. And even while I was there, we modified certain park features to have equal experiences as much as possible. So I think there's some benefits to, I guess, developing new park spaces in urban environments where you can incorporate this from the beginning in the design. But in terms of retrofitting existing, I mean, this was an issue with the FDR Memorial that opened on Roosevelt Island. The very last piece of the memorial, as it steps down into the East River, where it was a series of steps, And I'm not sure where they stand with retrofitting it, but it was part of the original design by Louis Kahn, and you know, there was like this historical aspect. But I think we do need to rethink what, you know, what are the trade-offs of doing something purely for a design perspective, and what is accessible.
Awesome. I guess since we're very close on time, any other questions from the audience that we may not have touched upon that you may want to bring up again? Or, and of course, you're more than welcome. I think you're able to unmute yourself, or feel free to put in the chat. Any last questions? Anyone else? Going once, going twice, because we're at 8:30 now. I guess we could end on this comment about the tent caterpillar also being deadly to a young tree. So is the tree better if we can help it grow, or let it die from the tent caterpillar? And then I guess we can talk about, like, end on decay, I guess, the conversation on death and decay.
I'll just say that there are tent caterpillars and there's bagworms, and they're often confused with each other. So I'm not sure which one particularly that we're talking about. But the tent caterpillars, which are usually on deciduous plants on small trees, can be detrimental. But you don't have to spray or anything. You just take a stick and you break open their web, and birds will come and eat them. So that also is how they can be incorporated into the ecosystem and the food web. On the larger trees, the most damage that they do is during the time when the leaves are getting ready to drop anyway. So typically on a more established tree with a big root system, it's really not an issue, but it is important for young trees to get them started on a good foot. And that's the easiest way and least harmful way to the environment. Just take a stick and break open the web, and you will see birds come.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mary. So yeah, our birds use the tent caterpillars as food for their babies. Exactly. Everyone wins. And like, I guess the moral of the story to this panel discussion is just like, yes, like, how can we find these relationships where we all kind of coexist, help each other out, like, symbiotically, in order for, like, every ecosystem to thrive, instead of kind of it being completely human centric, where we're just dominating the landscape, saying like how high, like how we should mow our lawn, like, you know, like listening whatever Better Homes and Gardens, I guess, tells us what to do, or I guess HGTV even, I don't know. But so I want to thank our panelists. Thank you so much for all your amazing knowledge and information, and spending this amount of time with us talking about such a sensitive issue, or like a hot topic right now. And I guess, like, in a previous conversation that we had, we talked about, like, how can everyone help? And for me, like, I felt like one way for all of us to help is just, of course, like, you know, the election is coming up. Vote, you know, vote for your ecology to thrive, vote for our environment to thrive, vote for this environment to be sustainable so your children can still continue thriving, but also not just us, but also like our greater ecology and stuff like that. And again, feel free to donate to great organizations like Blue Water Baltimore, or your local garden, or like, you know, work for your local garden, and, you know, all these other places that you can make a difference, even if maybe you don't have a green thumb, maybe you don't, like, you know, but there's other aspects on how you can and help the environment. I guess, Narisa, do you want to take to end everything?
Sure, thanks, Phaan. Yes, thank you so much to all our panelists this evening, Natasha Myers, Nicole DeFeo, Mary Lewis, and Phaan Howng, for such an engaging and important discussion. Mary and Phaan will be joining us again next month for our pollinator gardening workshop. We hope you'll join us for that. I want to once again thank all of our sponsors for supporting this program. Special thanks to ANCC Director Joanna Bakori and Phaan Howng for handling tonight's tech, and our graduate assistant Amy Bolt for facilitating the chat. A reminder to please complete the online event survey, and do show your support with a donation to the Asian Arts and Culture Center. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Good night, stay safe, and as Phaan said, go out and vote.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. And
Thank
thank
you
you,
so much.
Mary. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, Joanna. And yeah, have a great night. Thank you again. Good night.